Well, I spent my whole life in public service as an educator, and that really began with my experience as a kid. Both my parents were educators. My mom was a teacher and school counselor. My dad was a teacher and administrator. But they both passed away when I was little. My mom when I was 8, and my dad when I was 12. And in the period when it was just my dad and me, my dad was struggling with Alzheimer's. And nobody knew. And it was just the two of us in the house. And so home was just incredibly difficult. I didn't know what my father would be like from one night to the next. And the thing that saved me was school. School was the one place that was safe and consistent and nurturing. And as my father got more and more sick, just home became more and more difficult. I had to figure out how to get food in our house, how to keep our household going. And I didn't know why he was acting the way he was. So school really was a safe haven. And then after my dad passed, I moved around different family members, different schools, and I struggled the way a lot of kids who've experienced trauma struggle, and actually got kicked out of high school. And again, it was teachers and a school counselor and some family members who gave me a second chance. It would have been easy to write me off, to say, here's a Black Puerto Rican kid, family in crisis, struggling in school, no respect for authority, and just giving up on me. But I was lucky that folks invested in me. And because of that, I became a teacher. And I was a high school social studies teacher and then a middle school principal. Led schools at the local level and state level before coming to work for President Obama, first as Deputy Secretary of Education and then as Secretary of Education. And that's a huge sprawling responsibility. An agency with a budget $15 billion bigger than the budget of the state of Maryland, responsible for 50 million kids in K-12, 20 million plus in higher ed, and just such a privilege to be in public service in that way. And then at the end of the administration, I took over an education civil rights organization called the Education Trust that works on equity issues for low-income students and students of color, early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. And I also teach still at University of Maryland College Park because I love teaching. As an educator, you see how all the other systems impact kids and families, right? Whether or not they have affordable housing, whether or not they're food insecure, whether or not parents are caught up in our criminal justice system, whether or not parents can find a good job. So over my career, I got more and more involved in cross-sector initiatives. When COVID hit and I could see the disproportionate impact COVID was having, particularly on low-income communities throughout the state, I founded an advocacy organization called Strong Future Maryland to make the argument that as we recover from COVID, it should really be a New Deal moment where we take on some of our deeper systemic challenges. That it's not good enough to just get back to February 2020, but we actually should be more ambitious in trying to build a more just and prosperous future. And so that work got me very involved with the General Assembly and advocates around the state, working on issues like protecting folks from eviction, economic development in areas that have been historically underserved. And the more of that work I did, the more convinced I became that the next governor will be uniquely positioned to make government a force for good in people's lives the way schools were in mine. We passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That was a bipartisan effort at a time when almost nothing was getting done that was bipartisan. We had a Republican Congress, a Democratic president. It was very difficult to move things forward. But we really had a very productive bipartisan talks in Congress that helped produce that bill. And that bill really tried to get more resources to our highest needs schools, tried to emphasize equity issues and protection of civil rights, while respecting the role of states in leading in education. And required compromise on all sides, but that made me hopeful about our ability to get big things done in a bipartisan way. It's two things. One is a vision for how government can be this positive force that's grounded in my own life experience. It's not theoretical for me. I lived it. If not for the public school educators I had as a kid, I wouldn't be alive today. And so when I talk about the things we need to do, whether it's universal affordable childcare, or making it easier for small businesses to get access to capital, or broadband access. To me, that's about government trying to make it better for people in their lives. And I think I'm uniquely positioned to make that case. Education is the top issue for voters. And I don't think there's anyone who can speak to it as credibly as I can. I've spent my life as an educator. And knowing the work we need to do to address the impact that COVID has had on our kids. I'm the only public school parent in the race. I have kids today in Montgomery County schools, and lived through the challenges of the last 2 years for kids. And I'm very conscious of the work we need to do to address the academic impact, the socio-emotional impact on kids. I think we should have a statewide tutoring corps to mobilize recent college graduates and retired teachers to work with kids to address the academic needs, but also create mentoring relationships that can help kids feel reconnected to school. So that's, I think, a unique voice that I can bring to the race. Yeah. Well, three things. One is, we actually are in a pretty good position financially, right? We've got a $6-7 billion surplus. We've got a lot of federal money coming in, so we can follow through on the blueprint investment, and we need to. And we need a governor who's committed to that. I will be. And that will mean higher teacher pay. That will mean making our high poverty schools community schools with wraparound services, career and technical education programs to prepare young people for good 21st century jobs. There's a lot of good work that the Kerwin Commission laid out that we have to follow through on. But then there's the immediate, addressing the consequences of COVID, and there, I think we need the statewide tutoring corps. I think we need a lot more investment in school counselors and mental health services. And then the third piece I would say is, part of the Kerwin promise was expansion of pre-K. We can't do that fast enough from my perspective. The evidence on the benefits of quality early childhood education are that you get something like an 8-to-1, 9-to-1 return on every dollar invested. So we've got to move that work forward. It means we have to recruit teachers for those early years, for pre-K, for 4-year-olds, and hopefully pre-K for 3-year-olds as well. But we'll see long-term benefits from that in savings on social services, on special education, on incarceration. Early childhood is one of the smartest bets we can make as a society. The hope of the blueprint is that the state is taking on a little more of the share of the cost of education to make sure that every kid in the state is getting quality opportunities. Over the long run, the state's going to have to ask large corporations and folks who are making more than $1 million a year to pay their fair share to make sure that we can pay for this, not just for the next 3 years or 5 years, but 10 years, 15 years. But again, we get the money back, right? One of the challenges in Kent County is for employers is finding people with the right qualifications to do the jobs that are available. The solution to that is in schools, right? I was talking to a farmer in Kent County today who was talking about the challenge of finding folks to employ as drivers, and folks who have completed the training to be commercial drivers. Well, strong career and technical education programs can be the start of that. And we need to do a lot more to make sure that every student who leaves our education system is prepared to be successful, whether it's in college or directly into a career. Well, this has been, I think, a real weakness in the Hogan administration's approach. Not a lot of enforcement of the rules, particularly for poultry farmers, for example. So we've really got to make sure that we're enforcing the current law and that we strengthen the regulations to protect water quality, because everything hinges on that, right? Whether it's the watermen or tourism tied to the Chesapeake, it all falls apart if the water quality isn't good. We've got to do more on stormwater management. Regenerative agriculture can help us with that. So we, as a state, we have an interest in making sure that the Chesapeake is healthy. And so we've got to work with agribusiness to make sure that we're taking care of water quality. And then we've got climate change issues that we've got to worry about, right? Rising sea levels are already having an impact, whether it's on the loss of waterfront property, storm damage to piers, flooding, as we saw in multiple places in the state in the last year. So we've got to, I think, lead on the move to renewable energy, offshore wind, solar, geothermal, using agriculture for carbon capture. But we should make Maryland one of the first states to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And there are a lot of good jobs that can be created that way. Unfortunately, folks on the right have kind of hijacked the conversation with the phrase critical race theory. Critical race theory is really a body of legal scholarship. There's no first grader who's in a critical race theory lesson. It doesn't happen. I think we have to frame the question more as the need to tell the truth about our history, the hard parts and the good parts. So I live in Silver Spring in Montgomery County, about 25 miles from where my great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And the property, actually, where my great-grandfather was enslaved is still owned by the family that are direct line descendants of the family that enslaved my family. And they've maintained the property almost exactly as it was in the 1860s. Same main house that was built in the 1700s, and the cabin that my great-grandfather lived in is still standing on the property. That's real. That happened, right? And I've been able to see inside of that cabin, right? And to think about the role that slavery and segregation and redlining have played in our history. And students need to understand that, just as they need to understand the history of the Holocaust or Japanese-American internment. Right? It is also true that my family went in 3 generations from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first Black president. That's a powerful story of progress. And I think if we're truthful about our history, we share with kids both the hard parts and the progress that we've made. Labels, I say I'm an Obama Democrat, right? And I do think we should legalize cannabis, for example. And when we do it, we should expunge the records of folks who have those convictions. And we should make sure that the industry is one that all communities, including communities of color, can participate in, right? And not one just where big national corporations come in and take over the whole industry, right? But I don't know that that's a left-right position. Paid family leave, right? The idea that, after you've had a new child, you should be able to take time off of work. If someone in your family is sick, you should be able to take time to take care of them. And we should have employees and employers share the cost in that as a kind of social insurance. Like, I don't know, 80% plus support that. So that is a progressive position, but it's also common sense. So on the good side, I'm glad that he stood up to Donald Trump and that he stood up for the idea that when we have an election, the person who wins the election should take office. I'm glad that's his view. I'm glad that he is pro-vaccine and took the COVID crisis seriously. There were other Republican governors around the country that didn't, and that made a difference. That saved lives. Those are strengths in his record. Some of the things where I think we kind of stalled and didn't make the progress we should. Certainly environmental protection and climate action just weren't a priority for the governor. I think economic development for small businesses hasn't really been a priority. I talk to small business owners all the time who say they call state offices, can't get anybody to answer the phone. There's been, I think, commitment to try and help large corporations, but not attention to the needs of small businesses, getting access to capital, getting help navigating the state processes to get a license or the local processes to get a permit. And those things matter because in the end, small businesses are one of our best drivers of job creation. Public transit is a place where the governor just hasn't been committed, but it's also buses and transportation for seniors and folks with disabilities, which, you know, in rural parts of the state, those are critical. It's a lifeline to be able to get on a public bus and get to downtown, get to the doctor, get to visit your grandkid, and we should invest in that. So, you know, I think there's a kind of a lack of forward progress that is also part of the governor's legacy.